A message of hope this week comes to us from Matthew chapter 14 and verses 22 to 33. It's a famous story of Jesus walking on the water. And here is the reading. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus said to them, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got out down from the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me!" Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" When they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Thanks be to God for his holy word. Amen. Some of you might recall that a few weeks ago we were saying that the system of readings that we follow, called the lectionary, follows a 3-year cycle that was set many years ago. And yet it's often surprising, really, how it seems to resonate with our current circumstances. To be fair, though, I have to say that it is the preacher's task not only to ask the question, what does this passage mean, but what does this passage mean for this particular group of people at this particular stage on their faith journey? So in some ways it would resonate, but nevertheless we cannot help but feel that our particular passage today does resonate with our situation. Peter climbs out of the boat, and the boat has always been a symbol of the church of Jesus Christ. And that's why it resonates with us, because if you think of the church not only as the people, but also as the building, our current stormy climate, known as the COVID-19 pandemic, has forced us out of the boat and onto the choppy waters. To be fair, Peter chose to get out of the boat. We didn't so much choose, we've been forced out of it. And as the passage resonates with you, I wonder if you find that your experience of being outside of the boat is very similar to Peter's too. When Peter first gets out of the boat, he seems to be very excited, full of faith, walking towards Jesus. And then, here's the strange thing about it, really. He seems more perturbed by the wind blowing against him than he is by the fact that, ordinarily speaking, human beings don't walk on water. It's the wind that's buffeting him that makes him think, do you know, it's not just my body that's sinking, my heart is sinking with him. Here we are as Christ's people. We've been outside of the boat for a long time now. And when we first had to leave the boat, we felt we were going to make the best of a bad job. In fact, we found new and creative ways to be about mission. This here today, listening to me in this particular format, is an example of such a thing. But time's going on. Like Peter, we've had time to reflect. It seems to be a bit protracted, and I wonder what it's doing to your faith. I wonder what it's doing to those feelings of initial excitement. I wonder if your heart is beginning to sink. I wonder if you even think that you're going to be overwhelmed and that the church, represented by the boat itself, is going to be overwhelmed and swallowed up. I wonder how it's with you as you spend so long now outside of the boat. Nevertheless, there's a couple of basic truths in this passage that help us to be reassured as we spend so much time out of the boat. And the two basic truths are basically these. The first one is that Jesus is the Son of God, and he can do what you would expect God to be able to do. The second basic truth is this: Peter is not God. He can't do what God does. And we are not God either. And there are some things that can be expected of us, but there are limits to what being called to do, what we're being called to take responsibility for. Let's deal with the second of those truths first, the one that says Peter isn't God and neither are we. It's an interesting thing, isn't it, that yet again a story is being told that throws Peter into something of a bad light. Here's someone who, by the time the gospel was written, would have been a leading light in the life of the church. And yet there are so many stories that speak against Peter. And you can only think that these were stories that Peter spoke against himself. I wonder if Peter told these stories to remind himself and to remind others too, that no matter how big he became in the life of the church, no matter how leading a light, he wasn't God. He was simply the servant of Jesus, the servant of God himself, but he certainly wasn't God. When I think about these things, it reminds me of one of my all-time favourite vignettes. I think I must have heard this story when I was a teenager, but it's only a very small story, but it's the story of an elephant and a mouse who are crossing a rope bridge. And when they're about halfway across the rope bridge, the mouse is heard to say to the elephant, "Boy, we're really making this rope bridge swing, aren't we?" I think one of the reasons why Peter always tells these stories against himself, including this one today, is to remind himself and to remind us too that he is the mouse and Christ is the elephant. And it will be Jesus who will be making that rope bridge swing in a way that he never could. When I think about these things and that story, it reminds me, is me telling a story against myself now, of a time when, as Synod Secretary, I was asked by the Chair of District to represent him at the installation of a Roman Catholic bishop. And as I sat there waiting for the service to begin, I found myself sitting directly in front of a really big throne, the cathedra, in fact, after which cathedrals are named. And immediately my ignorance and suspicion and judgmentalism kicked in, and I started to think to myself, fancy having such a big chair, fancy being enthroned in such a way, what pride. Anyway, what's a reprimand I received when the bishop who was leading the charge for the new Bishop of Hallam reminded him of these things, he said, as you serve, remember that you sit in that seat that is so much bigger than you are, to remind you that you are never as great as the seat that you occupy. Rather than being a symbol of pride, as IMI judgmentalism had assumed it to be, it's actually a reminder that the Bishop of Hallam was the mouse and Christ was the elephant. This is an important truth for us to remember as we spend so much time outside of the boat. To remind ourselves that we are the mouse and Christ is the elephant. And there's just a limit to what we're responsible for and what we can do. Of course, by God's grace and with the Holy Spirit's power, this particular mouse can do, as we've said in previous weeks recently, can do extraordinary things. But nevertheless, we're not the elephant. I was reminded of this when I read a testimony this week from an ordained minister. And I thought I'd just read the testimony to you because I can't really improve on it. But it's very similar to the kind of thing about which we're speaking. She said, "We all variously allow our callings to blind us to our limitations and the long-term effects of neglecting self-care. But more importantly, we can forget that we are not God. And when we leave the earth, others will or will not carry on. Over that, we have no control. When I left home to attend college to prepare for my vacation, it was difficult and painful leaving my mother's side. She was an invalid, and I was the only child still at home to assist her and look out for her. I cried myself to sleep at night in my dormitory room. I felt I should be doing something more to help my mother. Even though I was able to obtain work the second day in my new city to send money home. My mother said she just wanted me to be happy. But it was God, I like to believe, who reminded me one night, through my tears, that God can do what I cannot do, in my presence, as well as in my absence. As we spend a protracted amount of time outside of the boat, that's what this passage is reminding us to. That like Peter, we are not God. And there are some things that we simply have to trust him to do. To remember that it was his church long before we joined him. And it will still be his church long after we've left the church militant to join the church triumphant. Here's the second thing that this passage is reminding us of. And it is that Jesus, as the disciples came to see, truly is the Son of God. Do you remember last week we were asking the question that when you see someone feeding a multitude of people in the wilderness, miraculously with bread, who does that remind you of? And we said, didn't we? Well, the thing that we start to think is, well, that's God. God did that with the children of Israel in the wilderness as they were heading towards the promised land, fleeing from their slavery in Egypt. And we made the point, well, if that's the kind of thing that God does, and Jesus is doing it now, what are we to make of Jesus? Here we find ourselves in this scene this week, with Jesus walking on the water. And again, we're meant to ask ourselves the question, who does that remind us of? The disciples, of course, when they saw Jesus walking on the lake, thought he was a ghost. Well, they were in the zone in some ways, because who you're meant to think of is the Spirit. The Spirit hovering over the waters of creation, the waters of chaos, actually, in creation, in that first chapter of the book of Genesis. And you're meant to say to yourself, if the Spirit hovers over the waters of chaos, bringing about creation, and Jesus does the same, walking on the water, what are we to make of this Jesus? Well, the disciples found their answer, didn't they? They said, truly, this is the Son of God. You are the Son of God. We're invited to make a response too. We're invited to say exactly the same words. If you put this passage back in its real life context, you find a couple of things really. One is Jesus, at the beginning of this passage, basically forces the disciples to go into the boat and therefore forces them to go into the chaotic waters on the boat. Chaotic waters, by the way, in the Hebrew mind have always been a symbol of the evils of the world. So basically, in Matthew's community, they are a group of people who've been forced into the evils of the world to go and be Jesus' witnesses. He does that in Acts chapter 1, doesn't he? Sends them out into the world to be his witnesses. But then Jesus, not in the boat with them, ascends into the mountain to be with his Father just as surely as he has ascended before they started their mission amongst all the evils of this world. It's almost as though he's left them alone to face the music alone. And what music it is. The passage tells us that the winds were buffeting the boat, but that's a really weak translation for what the Greek is actually trying to convey. It talks about the winds tormenting the boat, torturing the boat even, just as surely as the first disciples were being tortured and tormented by the Roman Empire. And Jesus had ascended. It seemed that it just left them to him. But this passage is there to serve to remind us of what our new president of the conference, Reverend Richard Teal, and vice president of conference, Carolyn Lewis, have been trying to remind us of in their year of presidency. To echo the famous words of John Wesley. The best of all is that God is with us. And as we find ourselves outside of the boat, not facing the storm of persecution, but the storm of a pandemic, perhaps as we start to look around and our faith starts to falter, perhaps even outside of the boat we need to remind ourselves that the best of all is that God is with us. Strange thing in a way when you think about it, at the beginning of the passage, Jesus forces the disciples into the boat to go onto those waters. But in a way, if they'd never had to face that crisis, they would never have experienced Jesus coming to them in the way that he did, walking on the water, doing the kind of thing that only God can do. They would never have come to know him as the Son of God without the crisis that they were going through. We were forced out of the boat by the pandemic. But in some ways I wonder if through it we'll come to know Jesus as the Son of God, doing the kind of things that only God can do in a way that we would never have known if the pandemic had never come upon us. The best of all is that God is with us. And interestingly, as people often say, Peter was safer with Jesus outside of the boat than he was inside of the boat without him. Take these words with you into the coming week. The best of all, God is with us.